Okay, so welcome back to Unpacking Possibility. I'm your host, Tracy Stein, and I am here with Jon Hoefer, whom we've met in part one of our interview about the book he just wrote recently, Avery's Gift, which is a book with many layers. It's about everything from an incredible friendship between a little girl and a little boy. It's about spirituality. It's got a lot of other deeper layered meanings. And so you'll listen to part one and hear more about that. But Jon and I were talking about spirituality specifically, the spirituality of this story and some of the characters, but also the spiritual aspect of doing something creative.
That's true.
So, Jon, I wanted you to talk about what you had just mentioned about choosing the non-human characters, the woodland creatures for this book.
Yeah, it's well, I appreciate you having me back, Tracy. It's it's a very the book was very is developed by inspiration. So when we were kind of working with the book in itself, we have come up with this little bit of a tagline, which has kind of worked in talking about the book, is about at the heart of the story is, and obviously, the story is, based around Avery and her having a heart that's not functioning well. And with Dalton's gift, she's given life. And so with the heart of the story is, we're finding that to be very different for many different people, and from those people that read things a little differently. So we have, from the heart of the story is generosity, the heart of the story is love, and it's of hope. And in my case, it's probably inspiration. And so when we were just talking about the book itself, part of my job of being creative and being a visual person, I have the pleasure of kind of seeing images that aren't, they're not in front of you. They come from within. And what we were saying is, sometimes you can sit down and say, "Okay, I'm going to write a book," or "I'm going to paint a painting." So sometimes you lead the project. But then there's a period of time when that project leads you, and you're not exactly sure what's happening. It's a very powerful feeling. And actually, we talk about chills. I actually just got it mentioning that. It's
your intuition.
Yeah, it's, when I was working with the story itself, which is, it's an emotional story. There's a heaviness in the same sense. I wanted, to appeal. Obviously, it has to appeal to people and for reading. And so on one hand, we want it to be a story that can be read by kids. And then on the other hand, we want it to be, the meaning that has a little heavier of a topic, but could be understood by people and then shared if they would like to. And so when I was going through the process of the story, Avery wakes up and she's lost her colors. The flowers from the wallpaper guide her outside. Again, we kind of touched on those a little bit about these symbols of being things that are happening in a real environment that's creating this dreamlike effect that's bringing her outside. And so I wanted this, because of her lack of color, I wanted the garden to be overemphasized in color. I wanted there to be beauty beyond belief. I was thinking Avatar and flowers and butterflies and fireflies and shooting stars, like all of these things that a kid would imagine to be a most magical place. And so I was thinking of them and the kids and saying, okay, well, if I was a kid, I would like to go out into the garden. I'd love to see all sorts of creatures and rabbits and raccoons and foxes. And so when I was originally sketching it, that was my sketch. The sketch was Avery getting out, going out of the room, going out into the garden, and having like Snow White, she's out there and all, people coming from all those stumps and around trees. And the funny thing was, though, what was in my head and that was coming out started to not feel right. And it was then, like we were just talking about, this is probably an hour plus of kind of just delving in and just focusing on this one task. And it became very clear to me that all these animals that was not important. But there were two animals in particular that became very important. One was the fox and one was the owl. And it was very clear. I mean, it was one of those where, okay, and I even have some preliminary sketches where I had, okay, I'm racing and scratching out raccoons and squirrels, but the fox was there. And I'm like, okay, I knew that connection with Fox and Avery needed to be like a long lost dog, like someone that she had, best of friends, and they just had this kin friendship. Even though it was a wild animal, we never made it look like she was apprehensive or scared or nervous. It was like, and even
It
in the
was a
book,
guide.
it was a guide. And even in the book itself, you'll notice that, and again, this is part of working with the illustrator, is that I wanted this fox to be more larger than life. So the fox is very, almost like, a fox generally is fairly small, but in the book, it almost has this sense like Avery is riding on its back. It's this fox is taking her somewhere. And so where the fox ultimately takes her was down to the Pebble Beach shore, which she finds Dalton, who comes from the fog, but she only finds him because she ran into an owl, and the owl knew, being the wise owl, that why she was there, and what she needed to learn.
And you had not been familiar with the symbolism of foxes and owls. And yet somehow, even though logically you're saying, I want to populate this whole landscape with all these adorable animals, you wind up taking them out and sticking with these two and assign the fox to Avery and the owl to Dalton.
Yeah.
And then you look up the symbolism.
Well, that's the interesting thing though, too, is, you were saying this like I made the decision. It was funny. The decision was made for me. I didn't decide, it was very clear that, okay, I wasn't like, oh, we got two animals, it was very clear that the fox was for Avery and then the owl was to be befriending Dalton, which made all the other illustrations work, because the fox was always by Avery's side, and the owl was always keeping an eye on Dalton and guiding him and landing on his oar, and ultimately, flying and guiding him away. And so, yeah, again, I'm getting the chills again, because I immediately after the final sketch, I'm like, okay, I'm wondering if there's is there any meaning behind this, right? And so just, our good friend Google is, looking up Wikipedia and say, what's the totem for fox and an owl? And the fox is, in the American Indian language, they were basically saying that seeing a fox the totem is for obviously sly and quick, but it's usually a sign of new beginnings and something's going to change. And the owl, its totem is for the afterlife, for heaven, for a guide. Usually it's a sign of either death has happened or death is going to happen soon. A lot of times, if there's an elder that's dying or someone that's dying, then an owl will appear and will either be in a tree or on the wigwam. So reading those four, I just kind of sat there stunned, because it wasn't a decision I made, but it was a decision made for me. But clearly there's reasons behind it.
When you were saying that a few minutes ago, it's no secret that I consider myself a spiritual person. You consider yourself a spiritual person, but everybody's spirituality might kind of look a little bit different in the way they think about it. And what I find with a lot of creative people is, we all have, the storyboard that you're sketching out, whether it's for, your prose or, illustrations and so forth. There's the one that makes logical sense. And then there's the stuff that feels like it's coming in from somewhere where it comes through you.
Right.
And when you describe the feeling of chills, I think many people listening will understand just instinctively what you mean.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that's intuitive. Now, whether that's coming from your own higher self or the ether or the divine or your guides, to me, it doesn't matter how people think about it. Those are ways I might frame it. Somebody else might say, well, I'm just inspired.
Mm-hmm.
But when you said, it felt like it wasn't even me deciding. That makes perfect sense. And so it didn't surprise me at all that when you looked up the symbolism of those two animals, that they fit perfectly.
Yeah.
I feel like when the story comes through that way, it has way more impact than when it's just our logical creative brain writing it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel that way?
Yeah.
Have you had more of those moments when you've written something, you've been like, okay, it's a different direction than I thought, but wow, this really makes sense?
Yeah, I actually think the same thing happened when I was writing it. Again, maybe this book is a little flip-flop where I knew the visual before the words, even though I knew the story. So when I knew that I wanted to do it into a prose, it's one of those where you have that, okay, I'm going to work on this today, right? So you sit down and clickety clack. Sometimes it feels like work. Then I think I kind of had a framework. Again, it wasn't done perfectly, but I guess I had the framework. And then it was the time where my son, we needed to move some things into storage. So we had to fly from Florida to Texas. And so on that flight is when sometimes it just works where you have a little bit of downtime. You're a little away from the world. No one can reach you. And I don't know if it was the white noise. I don't know what it was, but there was so much of the story that was written on that flight. And it even came down to like the last part of the story is probably when they were saying, okay, get ready for landing. And it was just, I would say that's when the chills happened again. Like it was just, the words were being flowed out, as opposed to me like consciously thinking, okay, what would be the perfect word, blah, blah, blah. That was probably the other thing that happened for this project in itself, is we landed and I was just, the very last words were written. And, it's getting, sometimes you find certain meanings and sometimes the meanings come later. The one thing now that the book is done, and I mentioned this the other night at the reading, is the one thing that I really love about the book is that the first two words is Avery's gift and the very last two words is Dalton's gift. And it goes full circle as to who's giving who what. And I really feel in both this case, there's two families, and truly, this is the beauty behind the tragedy. But I think that was one thing that was a little magical for me, or at least of finding of something that I didn't purposely do, but made sense. So there are a couple of things and a lot of things through the book that has happened that was a little more serendipitous, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, it is kind of cool. And again, I'm so grateful that you made time to speak with me today and talk about the gift of writing this book, really, and sharing this book, this incredibly important and moving story, and the larger stories behind it. So, Jon, again, thank you so much for being here. It's always a
Well, thank
pleasure.
you, Casey.
And this has been Unpacking Possibility. If you enjoyed the podcast, please remember to like, share, subscribe. Feel free to leave a comment, and we'll see you next time.